So today we're going to talk about building a better government. A lot of people don't necessarily know that the United States did not have the Constitution when it began. This was something that was done well after the end of the Revolutionary War. So that's what we're going to talk about. Most of this will be about the Constitution. Of course, your government teacher will do a whole unit on the Constitution, and they'll give you all the boring details and blah, 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 blah. We're not going to do that. We're going to talk about the important stuff and just understand how it works. Of course, again, your government teacher needs a job too. So say hi when you take that class and tell them you already know everything that you need to know. No, really, though, we do want to talk about what led to the development of the United States Constitution. And the first thing is that constitutional convention that we talked about sort of by default became the government once they declared independence. And in 1777, they drew up a document and called it the Articles of Confederation. The problem is it was terrible. And they found this out throughout the war. We mentioned in the lecture about the Revolutionary War that a lot of times the army didn't have enough supplies, and that was everything from uniforms to guns to food. And a lot of the reason was there was no real central authority that was making all that happen. Of course, George Washington was in charge, but it was this Continental Congress that changed every year that was trying to make decisions. The problem is they can't make decisions. You can see on this chart, there's a number of weaknesses that this government had. And those weaknesses were there during the war, but everyone was pretty occupied with not getting killed and trying to win the war. And it's not really until the war's over that these weaknesses really start to make themselves known. And we'll look at one specific example of that after this slide. But notice that this Continental Congress doesn't have any power to levy taxes. So how in the world are they going to get any money? They never had any money. That's why the army was always short. The Congress is always short, and it's a problem after the war too. Congress doesn't have any power to regulate trade, so states are competing with one another after the war's over, and that's not good for everyone. Congress had no power to enforce the laws. Everything was just sort of voluntary, and if a state didn't want to do anything, well, it just didn't do it. Again, this is why the army suffered and why there were problems later. 9 states had to pass a law to enact a law. That didn't always happen. Sometimes states don't care. 13 states needed to approve any kind of change, and you know as well as I do that that's never going to happen. That's completely absurd to think that everyone's going to agree. The executive branch just didn't exist. There was no person or even a little tiny group of people to make sure everything was being done, and they didn't really have a court system. How did they settle disputes among the states? Well, they tried to do that in this Congress, and it didn't work. So this was a huge problem. Now, during the war, this kind of manifests itself again in a lack of supplies and whatnot, but also in people like Benedict Arnold and others rebelling, and some of them turning coat and going back to the other side. Of course, they were all British at the beginning, right? Then they decided to declare independence. So Arnold just becomes a British officer later. Others in the army threatened to quit or go AWOL or mutiny, and some did. George Washington was even presented with a letter asking him to take over the government. And then at another point, he actually stopped a whole bunch of officers from trying to take over the government. But they wanted to put George Washington in charge of everything because they trusted him, because they knew he would. But he said, no, we're not doing that. We've got to maintain this distinction between the civilians and the military. This has to be a civilian government. So we're very lucky that George Washington was our commanding general. We'll also be very lucky, as we'll see, that he'll be our first president, right? Everybody knows he was our first president. So this Articles of Confederation thing is terrible. And so a few years go by when the war's over, it officially ends in 1783. They're going to meet in 1787 to try to fix it. So one of the examples that's always gets used to kind of explain why the Articles didn't work is called Shays' Rebellion. And so this is probably the worst example of this, but smaller examples of this are happening in other states. So in Massachusetts, as all the states, they're all super in debt, right? Massachusetts is particularly in debt because of closing Boston for that year, couple years, and all this stuff. Of course, a lot of fighting took place in the region. And so every state's in debt. And so, the only way they can get money is to raise taxes. So they do. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the taxes are so high that farmers are starting to lose their farms. When you can't pay the tax, they take your land and they throw you in jail. And these guys are saying, wait a minute, why are we paying more taxes now than we were paying when we were with the British? And they start complaining, and rightly so. And this causes a huge amount of problems. So Daniel Shays, who had been a captain in the army, gathers a bunch of guys. They arm themselves, and there's kind of a rebellion that happens for a couple of years in Massachusetts, and it kind of spreads and gets a little bigger. And there's some skirmishing and fighting that takes place. You can see kind of a painting of it here. What they're doing is they're protesting these super high taxes. They're taking over courthouses so that the government can't take away the land. If you stop the court process, the land doesn't get taken away. So this creates this understanding by a lot of people, and not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, that we've got serious problems. And this government we have isn't capable of helping, and the state governments aren't capable of helping. And so we need to do something different. And so, farmers, again, of course, upset about paying all these taxes, upset about losing their land. Most people in America are farmers. And so this is going to be a sentiment that is shared by a lot of people. And the leadership, those, we call them the founding fathers, all those people in the various Congresses, they start to realize, hey, this is bad. And George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Adams, all those guys start saying, we've got to do something different. So in the summer of 1787, they will have a constitutional convention. This is probably an image you've seen, this picture, George Washington standing there in this black suit. So this is 1787. They're going to send 55 delegates to Philadelphia. Where else, right? This is where they do everything else. And their goal originally is to correct these deficiencies that we looked at a minute ago in the Articles of Confederation. But once they get there and they start arguing about everything, which is really what they do, they realize that that thing can't be fixed, and they have to come up with a whole new system. So, obviously there's 55 men in there, and they have varying opinions on what should happen, and they're looking back to their states to kind of, keep in touch and get information. But they all do basically come to this understanding that something major needs to happen. So the reason George Washington is depicted that way in the picture is because he gets elected to be the president of the convention. Again, not president of the United States, but president of this convention. Who else, right? He's the one guy almost everybody completely respects and loves. So they'll put him in charge of it, and he'll make sure that everybody gets a voice and everybody gets their turn and all those kind of things. Now, Rhode Island does not send any delegates. They don't want to change anything. They value their independence more, I guess, than anything else. And so for this entire process and really for a couple of years, they won't even talk about this or entertain this. They will ultimately ratify the Constitution, but it's well after George Washington is already serving as president, which kind of tells you, the reality is, if you're this little tiny state, then you're not gonna be as important. But all the other 12 show up. James Madison is kind of a new figure we haven't talked about yet. He was involved in the war. In fact, he was wounded in combat with George Washington. And but anyway, now he's kind of a big wig in Virginia. He's known to be pretty solid with the pen, and he's sort of the principal author of this thing. And a lot of the ideas come from Madison. There are many, many other people that participate in this process. Benjamin Franklin's there, Patrick Henry's there. John Adams is not, but Samuel Adams is there. A lot of guys are there. A lot of the guys that were the founding fathers. This group of guys are called the Framers. So the first group in 76 are called the Founders. This group is called the Framers, and they all, again, basically or essentially agree on certain things, like this new government has to be able to regulate trade. This new government has to be able to provide a military of some sort, some kind of defense, right? Something bigger than the states. This government has to handle disputes between the states, and it has to be able to tax to do all those things. But and there's a few other things you could put on that list, but they all kind of agree that this government's got to be pretty limited to those things. They don't want it in your business doing things other than handling these big challenges. One thing about the military is all these guys don't really like having a military. In fact, when the war was over, they almost entirely disbanded the military. There were barely enough people to kind of watch the armories, and you had sailors, obviously, and that kind of thing. But they fear the army. Remember, to these guys, a walking, standing army in uniform represents tyranny and oppression. That's what the British did, right? The sight of that red coat made them angry because that's how the British imposed their will, was through these soldiers. So these guys are really paranoid about having armies. And they're really paranoid about having a government that's too powerful. So when they're in this meeting, they do a lot of yelling and a lot of arguing, and it's sort of behind closed doors, and it's hot, and I'm sure there's alcohol involved, and tempers are flaring, and this lasts over months. This goes all through the spring and summer and ends in September. But they do end up making a bunch of compromises. So two of the big things that come up in this discussion are the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan. The New Jersey Plan could be thought of as the small state plan. The smaller states, they want to say in the decisions that are made, and they propose, for example, that whatever legislature is made, everyone be represented equally. Well, the big states say, well, wait a second, that doesn't seem fair, because why should Connecticut or New Jersey get the same representation as a big state with a large population like New York or Massachusetts or Virginia? And so they offer the Virginia Plan, which is based on population. So they're going to argue about these things back and forth and a whole bunch of other things, but they will come up to a compromise. One's called the Great Compromise. It's kind of Ben Franklin and a couple other guys. Yes, Ben Franklin's here. He's in his 80s, and he still has some things to offer. And he basically says, well, why don't we do both? And we get this system that's called a bicameral system, where you'll have two houses. We'll talk about it in a second in some detail, but basically a compromise between the two. One house will be by population, one house will be by equality. They also come up with something called the 3/5 compromise, which is, how are we going to count slaves in this equation? And they agree that slaves will count as 3/5. So if we have 1,000 slaves, then we'll count 600 of those slaves in terms of figuring out how many people you have to represent. It's just a number. It doesn't mean they're less of a person. That's just how they decide to meet in the middle. It's a compromise. Kind of a rule on compromises is neither side really likes it, but it allows them to move forward. So again, if you have 100,000 slaves in the state, then they're going to count 60,000 slaves. This is why the census, by the way, is so important. So the government, the state and the federal government need to know how many people actually live in each state, because that determines how many representatives they're going to get. And so every 10 years, the United States has a census. So that's the primary reason. We use it for a million other things now. In fact, 2020, we're doing the census now. If you haven't filled yours out, you need to. So point is here, they're going to argue about a lot of things. They basically agree on a lot of essentials, but when it comes to how are we actually going to do all this, of course, that's where they start to fight. But they do figure it out. They do move on, of course, and here we are 240 or so years later, and we're still using the thing, which is pretty amazing. So we're going to end up with 3 branches of government. You probably heard this. Again, your government teacher will go into some of this, a lot of this probably with you. So let's talk about all 3. So we mentioned the New Jersey plan, the Virginia plan. This mostly has to do with the legislative branch, okay? And their job, and you see on the screen, their job is to make law. So one of the ideas you need to start getting to is this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. So the legislative branch makes law, but that's all they do. They don't do anything with it. They just together vote and say, this is now going to be the law. Somebody else's job to make it happen or what have you. We'll look at it in a minute. So again, you have this legislative branch, which is made up of Congress, which is the House of Representatives, as you see, and the Senate. So a minute ago, we said they came to a compromise, Franklin's idea to just merge the two. And so what we have is a Senate that's made up of 2 representatives from every state. So they're all the same on the Senate side. The House of Representatives will be based on population. Okay, remember, keeping in mind the 3/5 compromise and so on. So again, this is why it's important to count people. Now, this is where your government teacher will go crazy on how a bill becomes a law and all that stuff. Suffice it to say, for our purposes, the Senate and the House both have to pass a law so that it can get passed. All right. If they don't agree, then that law is not going to happen. Now, there's workarounds in the system, but they're very difficult. So remember, their job is to make laws. So those laws could regulate trade. You know, a lot of the things that we talked about in a previous, couple slides ago. The Congress is who raises taxes or levies taxes. Congress, handles treaties and, of course, signs off on treaties and does those kind of things, right? And they're not in Washington yet, but they will be. But they stay home and they deliberate and they argue and they make rules, okay? So that's one side. So then you have this executive branch, the one in the middle. And the White House doesn't exist yet either, but these are just representative. The Capitol building, none of these buildings actually exist yet. But the executive branch doesn't make the law, right? They don't decide what the law is, but when they are told what the law is, they then have to go enforce that law. If you want, the executive branch is the boss, right? They go and say, okay, if the law is we have to collect, a 5% tax on whiskey, then the executive branch sends people out to go collect the taxes on whiskey. But the executive can't say, well, I think I'm going to collect 6%, or well, I'm only going to collect 4%. He has to collect 5%. But he also has to hire the people to do it. So the executive, in our case called the president, has that kind of power to do that. And of course, we have a vice president. I wonder if you know what the vice president's actual job is. I mean, in modern history, it seems like the vice president's job is to be there if the president dies. And that's sort of true. I don't think they were really thinking in those terms in 1787. But we might think of the vice president as sort of a vote-getting flunky, right? The person running for presidents who we're really voting for, and then they'll choose someone who's going to get them votes. They all do it. This is not really anything new. The vice president actually has one job as outlined in the Constitution, that is to be the president of the Senate. So if the Senate ends in a tie, they have a tie vote, well, then the vice president gets to vote and break that tie. It doesn't happen as often as you'd think. And then, of course, different times where Congress is more or less deadlocked, it might happen more or less, depending on the time. So that's how it works. And then, of course, the president, sort of under the president and vice president, you have what's called the cabinet. That's just a nickname. That's not in the Constitution. As we'll see in our next lecture when we talk about George Washington, almost everything George Washington did kind of becomes tradition. And he appoints leaders of various arms of government. Like, we're going to need someone in charge of the money, and we're going to need a top diplomat, right? We're going to need a top guy in charge of the military, and a top lawyer, right? A top judge, a guy in charge of the Justice Department. And so that will become the cabinet. But remember, their job is to enforce the law, not make it. And that's part of that separation of powers and those checks and balances. This president also has veto power, where if Congress passes a law, he has to sign it, and then it becomes a law. If he says no or doesn't sign it, well, then it doesn't become a law. Again, they have ways around that, but it's a much harder thing to do. So the president has no law-making capability, but he does have to agree with the law in order for it to pass. So checks and balances. They're trying to keep too much power from going to one person or what have you. We'll talk about how we choose this president in a minute, but I'll say this. As they are developing this Constitution and they're thinking about the president and this leader and who it's going to be, I mean, they come up with all kinds of ideas. Should it be a group of 3 men or something like that? How long should this person be there? Of course, they decide on 4-year terms, and we've had an election every 4 years, rain or shine, war or peace, and we will have one this year, even with all this virus nonsense going on. But that's how they decide. Now, again, the election part of it's a little tricky. But the whole time they're thinking about all this, there's George Washington sitting in front of the room, kind of guiding everything. And they basically make this job for him. And then when this thing passes, they'll make him do it. And so that's kind of how the job materializes. So then the third branch is the judicial branch. Their job is to interpret law. I prefer the word adjudicate. So think about when there's a discrepancy or a dispute between 2 people or 2 parties or 2 states, and they're arguing about some point of law. It is the judicial branch's job to make a decision on how we're going to apply that law. Or if there's let's say there's 3 or 4 laws that sort of talk about this one situation, their job is to decide which ones are most important. So if there's a border dispute, they're going to work it out. If there's, a dispute over territory between the states, they're going to work it out. And of course, it has to do with criminal things as well. So the judicial's job is to adjudicate the law, to make sure the law is applied properly. They don't get to arrest people. That would be the president. They don't get to make laws. That would be the Congress. They just, once they're brought in front of them, they say, okay, this is how it works. All right. And of course, that is the Supreme Court. And then basically the Constitution says we're going to have a Supreme Court. Those people are going to be appointed for life. And the reason is they don't want them to be subject to voting and politics. They just want them to do their job. And then whatever other courts we need. And of course, as the country grows, Congress will make new courts, and then the president will staff those new courts with new judges, and then they will operate now independently of those 2 branches. But you see how they're tied together, but they're walled off from one another. So judges can't make laws, judges can't arrest people, all this kind of stuff. And I know today there's probably some leakage. There is definitely some leakage between those, but that's what they want. They want things to be separate. And a lot of the reason is they're paranoid, right, about a government becoming too powerful. So they're trying to make it strong enough to do the things they want it to do. Again, be able to have taxes, be able to deal with trade and disputes and war and stuff like that. But they don't want it so powerful that it can overwhelm the people. All right. So that is, again, the nutshell version of the Constitution. Now, one quirk here, of course, is the Electoral College. And every 4 years, or every 8 years anyway, half the country basically hates it and half the country loves it. But the reason they put it in there is it's basically another compromise. And remember, nobody likes compromises. Compromises, though, allow us to take another step forward. So this Electoral College idea is sort of a compromise between saying we're going to let Congress choose the president and we're going to let the people choose the president. The reality is they don't really trust either one, so they're going to kind of meet in this weird way in the middle. And so Alexander Hamilton's one of the people that kind of comes up with this idea, and it gets adopted. But by the way, there'll be many changes to it as we go. But essentially the idea is this president's going to be chosen by a group of electors, but each state will participate to the extent of how many representatives it has in Congress. So every state has 2 senators. So you go 2 plus however many representatives they have. So if you've got 8 representatives, you have 2 senators, then your state's going to get 10 electors to choose the president. And then those people, those electors, will just write 2 names on a piece of paper, and whoever ends up with the most votes will be the president, and whoever ends up with the second most votes will be the vice president. It's very simple. There wasn't really intended to be any campaigning. Notice I haven't said a word about political parties yet because they don't exist yet. That's something that develops later once everything gets going. Their idea was everyone's just going to serve for the greater good of their community, and then together they will serve for the greater good of the whole country. And it wasn't a job, it wasn't a profession like it is today. So that's how they do it. That's why they decide that. They don't want it left up to a pure vote from the people. They don't want this person just chosen by Congress, but they meet in the middle. They do want them chosen by people who kind of know what they're talking about, and the various states are going to have, a different amount of say. So yeah, if you're a small state, you don't get as much say. And notice the little map up at the top. That's the sort of a political cartoon that's been around for a little while, but it shows the relative power in the modern electoral college system. And it's not perfect. It's far from it. But you can see how big Texas, California, New York, Florida, I mean, this is not totally accurate, but it's making a point that those states weigh very heavily. You can look up all sorts of electoral college maps. LA County, for example, has more people in it than about half the states in this entire country. And so if we went to a pure electorate like Facebook, thumbs up or thumbs down, then LA County would pretty much decide who the president was every year. And if you don't live in LA County, I don't think you want that. Again, this is not a perfect system, and of course things will change. I'll highlight some of those changes as we go. But the essence was they just met a kind of middle ground so that they could move on. So usually whichever side's president loses says, wow, it's the fault of the Electoral College, and they want to change it. So just get used to that. Now, they finish this thing and they say, well, okay, how are we going to make this legal? Well, the Constitution says if we get a 2/3 vote of all the states, that'll make this thing legal. So right now it's just a piece of paper. And so what they do is they send it back to the state. Each state then is going to have its own convention where they're going to discuss the merits and the demerits, the pros and cons, right, of the Constitution. And so what we end up with is this big fight between a group called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists, and I want to stop here and make a quick point, do not confuse this with political parties later. In the next lecture, we'll talk political parties, and they share some names, all right? If you ever have Federalist and Anti-Federalist paired together, they're always talking about this issue of yes or no on the Constitution, all right? Don't confuse it with Federalists and Republicans, which is political parties. So you're warned. I'll warn you again when we come back and talk about political parties. So Federalists are people that say yes to the Constitution in their own state, and Anti-Federalists are people who say no to the Constitution. Modern people might think, why in the world would anybody say no to the Constitution? Well, there were quite a few people who said no, all right? But some of the people who said yes were men like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, James Madison, of course, others. But there were some very powerful men on the other side, like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry and many others, who said this thing is terrible. It's going to lead to some kind of oppression and dictatorship. And again, that's what they were afraid of. They didn't like that it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And so that's kind of the thing that changes a lot of the no votes, is they do promise to add a Bill of Rights. Part of the genius, I think, of the Constitution is it made it possible to change it, but not impossible, right? The Articles of Confederation, you had to have a 100% unanimous vote to change it. In the Constitution, it's diffused between the states and the Senate and so on, and it doesn't happen very often, but it is certainly possible. So they agree, hey, we're going to put a Bill of Rights in, because the big problem the Anti-Federalists have is there's no protection for the individual citizens. And the Federalists kind of argue, well, they don't need those protections because this government's, limited, right? Well, again, they're going to meet in the middle with this Bill of Rights thing. They're going to compromise, and they're going to move on. You can see here on the screen the list of states and how they voted. All 13 will vote yes, but notice that North Carolina and Rhode Island. North Carolina doesn't vote till November of 1789. George Washington's already the president at that point. Rhode Island doesn't bother until 1790. Again, George Washington's already the president. It's New Hampshire in June of 1788. That is the 9th. That's 2/3 of 13 is 9. And when New Hampshire voted yes, then this thing became the law, and they started putting everything together. Again, you had to count your population. You had to figure out who your senators and congresspeople were. They ended up having an election, and of course, everyone voted for George Washington. And so it got started, even though those other states hadn't said yes. Look at New York, though. They didn't vote until they were, number 11? Imagine, though, if New York had said no. But look how close their vote is. It's 3 votes different. Imagine if they had said no. Imagine if, Massachusetts, whose vote is about 19 different. If they had said no, I'm not sure this thing happens anyway. And again, to us modern people, it's pretty shocking that anyone would vote no, because we kind of hold the Constitution up to this super high level, which, again, it's a great system. It's not perfect, but it's great. It's hard for us to believe that people in the day and time would have said no. And in fact, it was a lot of people. But all of them passed it, and so it becomes the law. And it's worked pretty well, I think. So the last bit here really is just to talk about the Bill of Rights for a couple minutes. Again, you'll probably do more of this in your government class. We'll just kind of run through them. The text of these should be at the end of your book. Of course, you can look this stuff on Google. But very basically, they're going to produce about 13 amendments. They're going to vote on them in the process that's outlined in the Constitution. Remember, they built an amendment process into the Constitution. 10 of them are going to pass. This all happens in 1791. So they made it official in 1788. They started putting everything together. They elected a president, and they moved on. And we'll talk about all that in the next lecture. But they also got to work building these Bill of Rights, okay? So number 1 is 5 things. It's freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. And most people remember freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of press. Basically, you're able to practice any of these things you want. There are limits, but those limits are really far out there, right? And really what it's saying is the government's not going to interfere with you on these things. So you can basically say what you want, but if you lie, you can get in trouble. If you threaten someone, you can get in trouble. But other than that, you can basically say what you want. You can practice any religious persuasion you want. You can't kill people in the name of religion, right? That would bring the government down. Again, the newspapers can write anything they want as long as it's true. That's kind of the difference, right? Remember the old British way? You can say anything you want as long as it's not negative. Well, in America, you can say anything you want as long as it's true. And I know those lines are blurred and it's hard to tell a lot of the time. It's hard to prove. But that's the idea. If you are complaining about the government, you have the right to do that, and the government can't mess with you. Assembly is about assembling. You can assemble for whatever reason, unless you're assembling to foment rebellion or destroy property or something like that. And of course, petition means you can ask the government for whatever you want. And they might say no, but you can ask. You are a citizen of the United States. Number 2, of course, is the right to bear arms. Lots of arguments about this one, but at its heart is the idea that you have guns so that if the government gets out of control, you can shoot them. That is what it is about at its heart. Every state sort of interprets the rules differently on, does that mean you can carry a handgun or not? Texas is sort of in the middle. You can apply for a permit. Other states like New Hampshire basically say we don't care. And then states like California, it's nearly impossible to get a permit to carry a gun. Again, that's politics, right? Not the subject of this class. But the idea was you have the right to bear arms to protect yourself from the government. Number 3 is about quartering of soldiers. This just speaks to their paranoia. The British would just move their soldiers in. They would take over your house until they didn't need it anymore, and then they would leave. And you were just, happy to do your duty, right? Well, that's a symbol of tyranny. And so expressly in the Constitution is the government cannot put troops in your home. They cannot take your property for that purpose. Number 4 is about searches. It's sort of about privacy. Again, of course, it's been 240 years or so. 30 years now since this, and there is a lot of things that have happened technology-wise and whatnot. But this is basically saying that the government doesn't have the right to just barge into your business, in your house, for whatever reason. They have to get a warrant. Someone has to sign off on it. Someone has to be responsible. And yes, mistakes are made, and this does get abused sometimes. Of course, you watch television shows, right? Police shows, and the police just kind of bust down doors, and they break this rule all the time on TV. But if you did that in real life, you wouldn't have a job for very long. You'd probably be in jail. 5, 6, 7, and 8 pretty much have to do with rights that happen if you're on trial or accused of a trial. So like the Fifth Amendment, for example, you'll hear people say, "I plead the Fifth," because they don't want to answer a question. You're not required to testify against yourself or someone who's very close to you, family, like a parent or a spouse or a child. You don't have to. Of course, it makes you sound guilty when you don't, right? But you have that right. And there's other rights, of course, that are associated with being accused. Today it's the phone call. You have a right to an attorney, things like that. They don't have that in the Fifth Amendment. That's how it's been sort of interpreted over the last couple hundred years. You have the right to a trial by a jury. You have the right to, there's civil stuff and there's criminal stuff. Number 8 has to do with punishment. Usually we call it cruel and unusual punishment. Bails have to be set, and punishments have to be given that are, how do we say it, that are equal to what the crime was. So if you steal a bicycle, you shouldn't get the death penalty. If you steal a car, you shouldn't get the death penalty. Something like that. Your bail shouldn't be outrageous, should be small. Those kind of things. So, all of these things are they're basic rights that the Bill of Rights says you have. The government can't change those things. And then 9 and 10 are like a catch-all. It basically says whatever rights we didn't give specifically to this government, those rights are kept by the people. Anything we didn't mention or forgot to mention, that's kept by the people. And then number 10 says all these powers, the government, the federal government, only gets the ones we granted them specifically. They don't get all the other ones. Those stay at the state or at the individual level. So those are kind of the catch-alls. So, we can't think of everything, and so here's kind of the general rule. These are where your states' rights arguments can come from and different things like that. But remember, the intention of those framers was to build a government that was strong enough to defend the country and regulate trade and regulate disputes and that, but not going to be overwhelming your daily life. Again, you and I live in different times where part of it's because we have the access to the information, but part of it is, yes, this government does far more than it maybe was intended to. Again, that's politics. We don't do politics in my class. We do history. So that's the Bill of Rights in a nutshell. So that's it for this lecture. The next one we're going to talk about I call it Growing Pains. We're going to talk about the next 3 or 4 presidents. So kind of what goes on. We're going to start tracking things by who's president. That's a good way to do it from this point. So we'll talk about George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the events that took place while they were president. I call it Growing Pains because, you'd think, well, the Constitution's done and it's all wine and roses now, but it's not. Basically, they have this great piece of paper, this great theory, and now when they put it in practice, they run into a bunch of problems. I mean, you know what I mean, right? You have a plan, and you put it into action, and then things change. You realize that the way you thought of something isn't reality, or the way something works could work better, stuff like that. So they're going to start to disagree, though, on how to apply the principles they wrote down in the Constitution, and that is where we're going to get political parties from. So stay tuned for the next one.